On February 9th, 2004, Maura Murray, a 21-year-old nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. She got in her barely working car and left campus for reasons that have never been clear. She then made her way towards New Hampshire, and at around 7:30 p.m. that evening, Maura was involved in what's reported as a single-car minor accident. By the time police arrived on scene, Maura is nowhere to be found. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. This is the disappearance of Maura Murray. Now, before we dive in, I did a video on Maura back when I first started my channel. I have followed Maura's case for well over a decade, and to say I'm passionate about it would be an understatement. So you may ask, why am I doing another video? Well, as with a lot of my earlier content, there's vast room for improvement. I took some time diving back into this case recently, and I feel like I finally have the clarity, information, and tools to put together a great video. My goal is to make the quintessential Maura Murray deep dive. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Maura Murray was born on May 4th, 1982 in Hanson, Massachusetts. She grew up in a very close-knit family and had 4 siblings: Fred Murray Jr., Kathleen Murray, Julie Murray, and a half-brother named Kurt. Maura and her family grew up and spent a large portion of their childhood in Hanson, Massachusetts. According to Julie Murray, Hanson was a small, quiet town where the biggest thing going on most nights was a high school football game. Julie also described the town as having 1 Dunkin' Donuts and a couple of stoplights. To put it simply, Hanson was a small town where kids had little to do but spend their days outside, utilizing their youthful imagination. Maura's family was very working middle class. They lived in a small home on a dead-end street, and like a lot of American families, Maura's parents did all they could to provide a good life for their kids. Maura's parents, Fred and Lori Murray, would both divorce when Maura was only 7 years old. Following the divorce, Maura would primarily live with her mother. The divorce was a tough time for everyone, but the close-knit love the family had for one another got them through every hurdle life threw their way. Maura's half-brother Kurt was born shortly after her parents divorced, and even though Kurt wasn't Fred's son, Fred always did what he could to include him like he was his own. From all the information that I've gathered, Fred was a good father who worked hard to provide for his kids. Fred also did all he could to be a part of his children's lives, with sports becoming an important avenue for teaching and bonding. Maura attended Whitman-Hanson Regional High School, where she went on to become a very accomplished student and athlete. She participated in various sports, excelling in track and field. Maura was overall a very talented student, known for her intelligence and ambition. Maura and her older sister Julie both bonded together over running. They both ran track in high school, and their father Fred was also an avid runner who had completed 9 marathons. I suppose you could say that running was coded into the Murray family DNA. Maura would graduate high school with numerous accolades. She was the captain of the cross-country team, she set multiple school athletic records, she was selected as a Boston Globe All-Scholastic, qualified for the U.S. Nationals, and ultimately graduated 4th in her class. Following graduation, Maura had a plethora of schools that were looking to recruit her. She could have basically went to college anywhere, but in the end, she chose to follow in the footsteps of her older sister. Maura would be accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point. Julie Murray was the first to be accepted into West Point, and Maura idolized her big sister. While still in high school, Maura would travel to West Point regularly to visit Julie. According to Julie Murray, Maura loved everything about the academy. She stated that she talked it up big time to her sister and really pushed for Maura to join her there. At West Point, Maura would study chemical engineering for 3 semesters before she ended up transferring out to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. In Amherst, Maura would pursue a degree in nursing. Now, there has been a ton of speculation in regards to why Maura left West Point, so let's take a look at the facts and see if we can come to a conclusion. Now, West Point is no walk in the park. In fact, being a freshman there is hard. According to Julie Murray, the program there is designed to push you mentally and physically. It's not for everyone, and those that can't handle it are typically weeded out fairly quick. Julie Murray loved life as a cadet, but her sister Maura didn't share the same love and passion for the cadet lifestyle. Maura was clearly struggling in many aspects. The strain of not being in control of your own life at West Point had begun steering Maura down a dark corridor. Maura's sister Julie would reveal on her podcast that Maura had struggled with an eating disorder. Julie would briefly speak to Maura about it, but from what's been reported, Maura never truly opened up to anyone about this struggle. Eventually, Maura and her struggles would reach a breaking point. According to school transcripts that were obtained by the author James Renner, Maura's grades were severely suffering prior to her transferring out of West Point. On top of this, there was a reported incident where Maura was caught stealing from a store at Fort Knox. Maura had pocketed around $5 worth of makeup, and when she exited the store, she was immediately confronted by security. Maura would immediately admit to what she had done and was now going to face consequences for her actions. In the end, this crime went against the code that West Point cadets have to strictly adhere to. That code is, I will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. Those closest to Maura believe this action was a cry for help. Maura was struggling, and a transgression like this could potentially see her out of West Point. In my opinion, I think Maura was the type of person who didn't want to let her sister or her father down. I think she viewed quitting as a failure, and she simply didn't know how to get out of the situation she was in. Now, many have speculated over the years that Maura's theft is what ultimately led to her being kicked out of West Point. This has been debated for a long time, and when I first dove into this story, I gave my theory on what potentially went down. Here in 2025, we finally have a bit more clarity into the entire ordeal. Maura's theft did not lead to her being ousted from West Point. I believe it influenced her decision, but it's also been reported recently that Maura was closing in on a massive crossroad in her life. See, before you start your third year at West Point, you must commit to a minimum of 5 years on active duty and an additional 3 years in the reserve component or individual ready reserve. Maura was already struggling, she wasn't happy there, she had the theft situation, and she didn't want to commit to a military lifestyle for potentially the next 8+ years of her life. The military lifestyle is plain and simply not for everyone. In the end, Maura would transfer to UMass Amherst. For Maura, this was a fresh start, and a much-needed one at that. But sadly, this fresh start would be somewhat short-lived, as trouble was lurking just around the corner for Maura Murray. Now, before we dive into Maura's timeline in Amherst, let's talk about Bill Rausch, Maura's boyfriend. Maura met Bill at West Point when she was going through her punishment for theft. Bill helped Maura through the process, and the pair immediately hit it off, dating shortly after. Now, I want to highlight something. Julie Murray herself stated that Maura met Bill during the honor hearing proceedings at West Point, but I have seen some conflicting information. Now, from what I saw reported, there's a statement that was made by Bill Rausch where he said he had nothing to do with Maura's honor hearing. Bill was a cadet honor representative, so it's always been said that he helped Maura and met her through the process. But according to Bill, he met Maura through Julie in 2001. This doesn't line up with Julie's telling of events. I also noticed that Julie stated she didn't really know Bill prior to Maura meeting him. I'm not sure why there's a discrepancy in stories, but let's go ahead and keep moving forward. With Maura choosing to leave West Point, her relationship with Bill soon became one of long distance. The first red flag in their relationship would occur when Maura found out Bill was cheating on her. Her sister Julie would implore Maura to leave Bill and move on with her life. But ultimately, Maura made the choice to try and make things work between the two of them. Many have questioned whether or not Bill was emotionally or even physically abusive towards Maura. According to Maura's family, they never witnessed anything of the sort, but it's clear their relationship was experiencing a lot of strain due to the distance between them. Now, let's go ahead and dive into the timeline of events leading up to Maura's disappearance. We will start things off first in November of 2003. Maura was caught and admitted to using a stolen credit card to order food from several restaurants near campus. This charge would be given a continuance in December of 2003 and was set to be dismissed after 3 months of good behavior. This was the first bit of trouble Maura got in Amherst. February 5th, 2004, Maura was working at her on-campus security job. At around 1 to 1:20 a.m., Maura's supervisor would escort Maura back to her dorm room. She described Maura as being completely zoned out and clearly dealing with emotional stress. But what led to this very moment? Let's analyze what we know. At 7:17 p.m., Maura spoke with Bill Rausch on the phone for around 20 minutes. At 9:56 p.m., Maura and Bill spoke once again for around 6 minutes. At 10:10 p.m., Maura speaks to her sister Kathleen on the phone. This call goes on for 28 minutes. During this call, Kathleen informs Maura that she had just gotten out of rehab and that her significant other took her straight to a liquor store. Many point to this call as being the reason for Maura's distressed state later in the night. Here's my issue with this. As following this phone call, Maura proceeds to work for around another hour and a half or so before getting on her phone again. This was her third call with Bill at 12:07 a.m., and this call went on for around 7 minutes. She would then work for just shy of another hour until around 1 a.m. It's around this time that Maura's supervisor relieves her and tells her to go get some rest. She stated that Maura was clearly not okay and that the only thing she stated was "my sister." This "my sister" comment seems to be referencing her call with Kathleen. But what I don't understand is, if this call was so upsetting, why didn't Maura leave work for close to another 3 hours after it? Was Maura upset from her call with her sister, or was she upset after the most recent call with her boyfriend Bill? Or could there have been something else altogether? Saturday, February 7th, Maura's father Fred Murray arrives in Amherst to go car shopping. Maura's Saturn is having issues and appears to be down a cylinder. To put it simply, the Saturn is in no condition to be driven around at all. On his way to Amherst, Fred would make numerous stops on his way to ATMs, taking $400 out at a time and arriving in Amherst with a total of $4,000 in cash. The pair would look at cars before calling it a day. At 6 p.m. that evening, Maura, Fred, and Maura's friend Kate would have dinner together at the Amherst Brewing Company. After dinner, the trio would travel to a nearby liquor store to pick up alcohol. Fred stated that Maura got a box of wine to drink that night. Following this stop, Maura would drop Fred off at his hotel room. Maura then borrows her father's brand new Toyota Corolla for the evening. Maura and her friend would attend a party for most of the night. This party is another area of contention, as it has been close to impossible to find out who attended this party. Author James Renner theorized that this party may have been a going-away party for Maura, but at the end of the day, it's another theory with very little evidence to substantiate. Now, based on Kate's recollection, she left the party between 1 and 2 a.m. I listened to Kate's most recent interview, and I think it's great that she was willing to open up about that night, but I also feel like her answers were left very ambiguous. She was there with Maura. It was the last night they spent together, and I understand it's been a long time, but I feel like you would remember the details of a night like that. Sunday, February 8th at 3:30 a.m., Maura decides to drive her father's car back to his hotel. It's during this trip that she has an accident in Fred's Toyota. The officer that arrives on scene ends up letting Maura go with no charge, and she gets a ride from the tow truck driver to Fred's hotel room. One of the weirdest aspects of all this, aside from the officer not giving Maura a DUI, is the fact that it has been reported that a police cadet was the one to call in Maura's accident at the time. Yet to this very day, we don't know the name of the cadet, and as far as we know, no one has ever interviewed this cadet. It begs the question, did the cadet happen upon Maura's accident, or was the cadet potentially hanging out with Maura that evening? Also, if Kate is to be believed, and Maura left that party at around 2 a.m., then what was going on for around the next hour or so? Was Maura really driving to her father's hotel room? Was she with someone during that time frame? Could that cadet have been the person she was seeing behind Bill's back? As of now, we don't have any clear-cut answers, but I do believe there is someone out there that can shed some more light on this aspect of the timeline. I hope they one day speak the truth. Maura would get dropped off by the tow truck driver at Fred's hotel room, and at 5 a.m. that morning, a phone call is placed from Fred's cell phone to Bill Rausch. According to reports, this phone call was placed by Maura. Later in the morning, Fred wakes up, and Maura informs him of the damage to his car. Fred is upset and concerned that his insurance won't cover the damage because Maura was driving the vehicle. After placing phone calls that morning, Fred is relieved to find out that his insurance will indeed cover the repairs, and all he will owe is his $500 deductible. Now, the internet has speculated for a long time that Fred got extremely angry with Maura. Fred has denied yelling at her, and in the end, only Fred and Maura know the truth, so I am inclined to believe Fred's account of how things went down. Monday, February 9th, Maura was still beating herself up about what had happened with her father's car. With this weighing on her, Maura ends up staying up really late into the early morning hours. Just after midnight, Maura places phone calls seeking information for renting a condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire. There are reports that she stayed up until 4 a.m. looking at rentals, but there has never been any evidence found that she actually booked a rental anywhere. From evidence gathered on her computer, Maura did look for directions to Burlington, Vermont, and Bartlett, New Hampshire. She was clearly looking to get away and had not settled on any one location as of yet. Later that day, at 12:55 p.m., Maura once again continues her search to rent a condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire. At 1 p.m., Maura emails her boyfriend Bill Rausch that she doesn't want to talk, will call later, love you stud. At 1:13 p.m., Maura calls her classmate Aaron O'Neill about returning some clothes to her. At 1:30 p.m., Maura emails her professors and work supervisor about a death occurring in the family, notifying them that she will be away for at least a few days. This death in the family was completely fabricated by Maura. At 2:05 p.m., Maura calls 1-800-GO-STOW, which is for reservation information in Stowe, Vermont. At 2:18 p.m., Maura calls her boyfriend, Bill Rausch. I also want to note something that I think is important. At some point that morning, Maura completed and submitted her homework. Now, some have pointed to Maura running away permanently, and others have embraced the theory that perhaps she traveled to New Hampshire to end her life. The fact that she was completing homework tells me that she seemingly had all intentions of returning from this trip. At 3 p.m. that same afternoon, Maura proceeds to leave campus in her extremely unreliable vehicle. At 3:15 p.m., Maura takes $280 out of her account at an ATM, leaving just shy of $20 left in her account. The police would later release CCTV footage of Maura at the ATM. She appears to be alone at the time, but it's unknown if there is someone else in her car. At 3:43 p.m., Maura purchases liquor for her trip. She spends around $40 on Kahlua, vodka, Bailey's Irish Cream, and a 6-pack of malt beverages. She also returns cans at the time and receives $3.95 back. For those that don't know, some states in the U.S. have a bottle deposit on certain beverages like soda and beer. In Massachusetts, it's 5 cents each, which then encourages those that buy them to return them for recycling purposes in order to then have their deposit refunded. We don't know where Maura goes after the liquor store. All we know is that she heads towards New Hampshire. Monday, February 9th, 7:27 p.m. Faith Westman places a phone call to the police about Maura's accident, which she saw from a window within her home. Now, there was a theory brought forth by Art and Maggie on the Oxygen series The Disappearance of Maura Murray. This theory was that there was an hour of time unaccounted for on Maura's trip to the accident site. After doing my own research, I don't believe there's a missing hour. One thing that isn't always taken into account is the fact that Maura's vehicle was running down a cylinder. I have experience driving a vehicle on 3 instead of 4 cylinders, and I can say it's a struggle. I believe the issues with her car, along with her stop to get gas at some point not long prior to her accident, can account for some of the missing time that Art and Maggie talk about. I also want to point out that inside Maura's car, police located accident forms. These accident forms were something that Maura's father had asked her to get for him. Based on the timeline, this means that Maura, at some point on Monday, stopped and picked up these forms before leaving Amherst. This can explain some more of the missing time, and this also tells me, once again, that Maura had all intentions of returning from this trip. There's no reason for her to pick up these forms if she wanted to get away for good. Before we dive into everything further, I want to be upfront that I'm going to do my best to give an accurate timeline. What occurs after 7:20 p.m. has been debated for ages, and all we can do is try to put the pieces together in the best way they fit. Let's start with Faith Westman's call to the police at 7:27 p.m. Now, according to the police, this was the first notice the police were given about Maura's accident. Faith Westman reported a car facing the wrong way on the side of the road just past the Weathered Barn, a local antique store. She also made 2 other statements while on the phone with the police that raised more questions than answers. The first statement was that she can see a man in Maura's car smoking a cigarette. However, there is no mention of recovering any cigarette butts from the crime scene or car. She is also reported as mentioning a flurry of activity near the trunk while on the phone with the police dispatcher. Neither of these statements can 100% be confirmed nor denied. What I find further interesting is that if you look back through Faith Westman's 911 transcript, any mention of the flurry of activity or a man with a cigarette appears to have been redacted, which begs the ultimate question: why? Now, after the Westmans placed their phone call to the police, Butch Atwood, a bus driver that lives right up the road from where Maura's car was, stopped in his bus and spoke with Maura briefly. According to Butch, Maura was in her car with the lights off, and the car was facing the wrong direction on the road. This was one of Butch's accounts, as according to Fred Murray, Butch said he walked down the steps of the bus and spoke with Maura, who was on the driver's side of her car, in between the car and the snowbank. Which statement is accurate? I'm not sure, but Butch spoke with Maura briefly and asked if she needed help. Maura told Butch that she had already called AAA and that she did not need any assistance. This was an odd answer, as Butch was aware that there is 0 cell service in the area, something that remains true to this very day. Butch then left the scene and finished the short drive up to his house. At 7:42 p.m., the Butch Atwood residence would place a phone call to the police. Dispatch would call the Atwoods back at 7:46 p.m. According to reports, Officer Cecil Smith would arrive on scene at 7:46 p.m. This is where the timeline begins to fall apart, though. A woman known as Witness A drove by the scene that night. It is believed that she passed around 7:33 to 7:37 p.m. and saw Maura's car along with the police SUV marked 001. According to Witness A, SUV 001 passed her twice with its blue lights on. The first time was before the sharp left on Goose Lane, and the second time was several minutes later. This places the police on site far earlier than what's been reported. At the same time, this opens up another question. According to Butch Atwood, he could just see Maura's car from the driveway at his house. It's believed he parked his school bus, waited a few minutes before going into his house, as he usually finishes his paperwork in the bus at the end of the day. Why would Butch call the police at around 7:42 p.m. if at that point the police may have already been on site for a handful of minutes? I looked deeper into Witness A's timeline, and according to her story and her cell phone record, her passing the scene between 7:33 and 7:37 does make logical sense, and in no way does she come across as someone who's trying to insert herself into the case for the hell of it. As you can see already, the biggest issue with this case is the fact that we just don't have a concrete timeline. But what we do know for certain is whatever happened to Maura happened roughly between 7:30 and 7:46 p.m. If you believe in Witness A's account of things, then it narrows things down even further to between 7:30 and 7:37 p.m. Another interesting detail in all this is the fact that Witness A placed the police SUV on scene, while Cecil Smith and Trooper Monahan originally placed the police cruiser or car on scene. Could this be a case of misremembering over time? Perhaps, but I find the conflicting reports amongst the police and witnesses to be alarming. But for right now, let's continue on in the timeline. The officer first on scene was Cecil Smith. According to Smith, he checked the vehicle to see if anyone was hurt prior to calling it in. Within 4 minutes, he put out a be on the lookout for a 5'7" female on foot. Now, Julie Murray recently pointed this out in her podcast. How did Cecil Smith know Maura's exact height for his BOL? According to Julie, she asked the police detective, and no one could give her an answer. It's just odd to say the least. Now, around this time, State Trooper John Monahan arrived and spoke briefly to Officer Smith. Butch Atwood would also be spoken to, and Butch would offer to drive his personal vehicle and look for Maura. Butch Atwood would travel up the road, while Officer Monahan would travel along some of the roads back the way Maura had come in order to see if they could locate her. At the scene, Officer Smith would notice red splashes in the snow. Now, I have looked through the police transcripts in detail, and I found more inconsistencies in the reporting. According to Cecil Smith, Maura's car was locked, and he did not enter it. Also, according to Officer Smith, He did not discover the cup of wine/soda that Maura had been drinking from until the tow truck arrived and began to tow Maura's car away. He stated he found the cup under her car. The problem with this statement is that it doesn't line up with Trooper Monahan's account. Trooper Monahan has stayed true to his account from the very get-go, and he stated that he pulled up and spoke to Cecil Smith for a couple of minutes. In that conversation, Cecil Smith stated, "There's a box of wine in here, and it looks like she's been filling up a soda bottle with wine." This comes across as an egregious error within Cecil's report on what happened that night. When Trooper Monahan arrived on scene, the tow truck was not on site as of yet. Also, based on what Cecil stated, it sounds like not only was he looking in Maura's car, but he clearly found her cup of alcohol long before the tow truck actually arrived. Now, Cecil Smith's official report states they never gained access to the car the night of February 4th, but there is a witness that passed the scene that night that states otherwise. Susan Champy, a local of the area, stated that she passed the scene of Maura's accident, and the police were there, and the door to the Saturn was open. Susan isn't the only witness to claim that they drove by and the car doors were open. Now, normally when looking into an investigation, you want to give the benefit of the doubt that some details can end up being reported incorrectly. My biggest issue is the fact that there are issues with numerous details in Cecil Smith's reporting. If you'd like to dive deeper into the full transcripts and everything, I highly recommend you check out the website, the107degree.com. I will link it in the description box below. There, you can find the police reports and transcripts, and overall some great breakdowns of the timeline and inconsistencies throughout. Ultimately, the night would end with the police believing that whoever had been driving was intoxicated, and that they had simply run off to avoid receiving a DUI. What's alarming is the vehicle was clearly in an accident. The airbags were deployed, and there was a crack to the windshield, which all reports believe occurred from within the inside of the vehicle. There were red flags that ultimately should have been followed through on. Another thing I find alarming is that EMS showed up on scene and were very quickly cleared and sent away. Looking at it all, it's clear someone was in an accident bad enough to set off airbags. You're under the impression it's a small, 5'7" female who's from out of town, potentially intoxicated. Oh, and she can't be found? The entire thing baffles me, but that's not the end of the odd occurrences, as a tow truck would be called to come get Maura's car. Northland Towing was on call that night and should have been called to get Maura's car, but for some reason, Mike Lavoie was contacted and he came for the car. The owner of Northland Towing was so upset with the situation that he actually showed up at the accident site to voice his displeasure. But in the end, Mike Lavoie towed Maura's car out of there, taking her vehicle to his personal garage. Why his personal garage, you ask? Well, your guess is as good as mine. With her car towed away, the search would come to an end that night at 9:26 p.m. While Maura, well, she would never be seen or heard from again. February 10th, 2004. It would take most of the day before the Murray family was finally reached and notified that Maura was missing. It was late in the afternoon when the Murray family had this startling news dropped on them. From the very get-go, Fred Murray was on top of things, trying to find out what was going on and what had happened to his daughter. It seems like from the beginning, Fred was getting nowhere with the police. It didn't seem like Maura's case was much of a priority for them. It didn't seem like the police were at all concerned about Maura in general. Fred would soon arrive in New Hampshire Wednesday morning at dawn. He was immediately alarmed at how little was being done for his missing daughter. Fred basically became a one-man search and rescue as he started to look over the area where Maura had gone missing. From Fred's account, the snow was 2 feet deep, and it was impossible to traverse a lot of the terrain without leaving some sort of prints. He didn't find any sign that Maura had wandered into the woods in the immediate vicinity. Fred would soon make his way to the police station, where he felt like no one really wanted to talk to him about Maura's disappearance. His own words were that the police were very evasive. Later that afternoon, the state police canine unit checked the area where Maura went missing. Now, for years it's been reported that the dogs picked up a scent and tracked it down the road a little ways and then lost it. This has led to so many people assuming that she was picked up by someone. Well, according to Fred Murray, that's not exactly what happened. As he spoke to the canine unit himself, the moment they returned from the scene. They were relatively confident that the dogs never really had picked up any scent. According to them, it had been far too long since she went missing, and it was also far too cold, and the conditions of the road and area were not ideal for trying to pick up a scent. To make matters worse, the unit used a pair of gloves that Maura had just received for Christmas, and Maura's family, they don't believe Maura had ever even worn this pair of gloves. For me, this is just another of the many blunders by the police department. Eventually, a full search was done of the area. Helicopters were brought in, and thermal imaging was used to try and find Maura. But all efforts in the end came up empty. That didn't stop Fred Murray, though, from trying. As weeks and months continued to pass by, Fred Murray drove to New Hampshire every weekend and continued to push for answers in his daughter's case. For me, I used to always be convinced that foul play occurred in this case. From the very beginning, I believed that she had stumbled into the clutches of someone who saw an opportunity. But over the years, I've tried to separate myself from that mindset and take a closer look at all the details that we do know for sure. After years of diving into true crime, following numerous podcasts, and watching every disappeared episode what feels like 100 times, I have really embraced the idea behind Occam's razor. For those of you that don't know what Occam's razor is, I'll try and explain it as simply as possible. Occam's razor means that if you have two competing ideas to explain the same phenomenon, you should prefer the simpler one. More often than not, in a lot of cases, the simplest answer tends to be the correct answer. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive into some theories on what happened to Maura Murray. As we dive in, I want to say that I am aware that there are a boatload of theories out there. If I tried to touch on every single one, well, this video would be longer than watching the Lord of the Rings Trilogy Extended Edition.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No! No!
Now first, let's discuss Maura's boyfriend at the time, Bill Rausch. At the time of Maura's disappearance, Bill was a lieutenant in the Army, stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There has been a ton of speculation about Bill's involvement in Maura's disappearance over the years. Some people to this very day believe that Bill had something to do with what happened to Maura. According to reports, Bill was nowhere near New Hampshire at the time of Maura's accident, but I do believe that Bill could have had something to do with why Maura was in New Hampshire on that fateful day. According to family of Maura's, her relationship with Bill was heading towards its end. Maura's sister Julie even stated that she encouraged Maura to move on from this toxic relationship. The narrative that Bill and his mother spun after Maura's disappearance about how they were planning to get married, etc., I believe it was a way to positively spin things, and the truth was much darker than the one media was given at the time of Maura's disappearance. Bill had been unfaithful to Maura, and something like that can affect a relationship for its entirety. There has also been a lot of speculation that Bill was controlling and could be verbally abusive. Ultimately, we don't have a lot of factual evidence to drive the narrative in one direction, but what is most alarming is that Bill Rausch was recently facing a felony third-degree SA charge for an incident that occurred with a female coworker back in 2011. From what has been reported, he pushed his female coworker up against a desk and pressed his erection into her backside. There's also a report that he pushed the same woman down an escalator. Ultimately, he would accept a plea deal with a potential for 180 days in jail. I don't feel like this was a punishment enough for the crimes he committed. Also, behavior like this leads me to question what else this man is and was capable of. Could he be a prime suspect in Maura's disappearance? On top of all that, no evidence has ever been given to 100% verify where Bill Rausch was the night Maura disappeared. Numerous attempts have been made to gather plane tickets or any kind of record to show that Bill made the trip from Oklahoma to New Hampshire. So do I think Bill did something to Maura? I don't think he did anything directly himself. I think he may have been part of the reason why Maura was heading to get away. I think their relationship was toxic, and I think there's a possibility that Maura was seeing someone new. But we'll get into that more in a bit. So with my thoughts on Bill out of the way, we will now dive into other theories in the case. First, let's break down a little bit more of what we know for sure. We ultimately know Maura had intentions of leaving Amherst and getting away. From all signs, she had intentions of returning as well. She completed her homework before she hit the road, picked up the paperwork for her dad from the accident. Just these actions alone tell me that she had all intentions of returning at some point. Now, was Maura alone on this trip, or was someone following her in another vehicle? Could someone have been meeting her somewhere? We have footage from the ATM machine that helps with the timeline. We also know she went to the liquor store. There she returned a bunch of bottles for some cash. There were theories out there that Fred had given Maura a bunch of the cash when he was visiting that weekend so that she could start a new life. I believe if Maura was that financially secure at the time, she wouldn't have bothered to take the time to return the bottles and cans the way she did. We know that Maura withdrew $280 from her account, which was most of what she had. We also know that she spent roughly $40 at the liquor store. Now, if there was video collected from this liquor store, I really hope the police release it to the public one day. Knowing whether it was Maura herself or someone else would really help shed some light. Ultimately, we don't know what happens between the ATM and the accident. We believe Maura purchased the liquor, but there remains questions as to whether or not she was alone on this trip. With that in mind, we will continue on in the timeline with two thoughts. One, that Maura is alone, and two, that Maura made the trip with someone else in tow or with someone else following her or meeting her somewhere. Based on reports and information I've looked over, Maura had to stop for gas at some point along the trip. Her car was found abandoned in Haverhill with close to a full tank of gas. Now, I have seen some conflicting information on this, that it was not full, but more like 7/8 full. Either way, Maura had gotten gas somewhere not too long prior to her accident. The biggest issue with this case is the misinformation, along with details reported that don't always line up with other reported details. There has always been speculation as to whether or not it was even Maura at her car at the accident scene when everything transpired. But for the sake of all these theories, I'm going to continue to follow Occam's razor. The simplest answer would tell me that yes, Maura Murray was at the accident scene of her car. So then, what happened to her in that very brief amount of time before the police inevitably showed up? One detail in the case that I can't seem to shake is the man with a cigarette. Faith Westman reported this to police dispatch when she called in Maura's accident. Numerous people have debated this over the years, with some trying to discredit this report, while others have tried to take this piece of information to prove the narrative that there was a man on scene with Maura. Now, we know Butch showed up in his school bus around 7:30. From reports, Maura was sitting in her car with the lights off. Butch exited his car, shined a light, and briefly spoke with Maura and offered to have her ride with him to his house, which was right up the road, and wait for police. At least that's the one take from Butch. As we stated before, Butch also told Fred that he stepped down the steps of his bus and spoke to Maura, who was on the driver's side between the car and the snowbank standing there. Where the truth is there, I don't know, but Butch did tell officials that Maura declined his invitation. So in keeping with the simplest answer again, I think Maura declined Butch's invitation because she had been drinking. Plain and simple. She told Butch not to call 911 as she had already called AAA. Why lie about that? Well, Maura had been in trouble numerous times prior to this incident. Now, we don't know how intoxicated she was at the time, but I feel that we can ascertain that she was at the very least slightly intoxicated and probably extremely upset with what had just transpired with her accident. She was looking to get away after nothing going right back in Amherst. Now she goes to New Hampshire, and things continue to not go right for her. As a young 20-something-year-old, it can feel like the world is out to get you at this point. So Butch Atwood drives away, and this is around the time we get the report from Faith Westman that there was a flurry of activity around the trunk of Maura's car. Some think this is clearly her being abducted, but as I said earlier in the video, I'm going to follow nothing but the simplest answer. Maura was upset. How do I know? Well, as I said, life wasn't really going her way this past week. Now, she was stuck in a predicament where things were about to get even worse for her. Butch had just told her he was going to his house to call the police. If I was Maura, I would have waited for Butch to drive away, and in that time, I would have started thinking. And it wouldn't take long before I realized, damn it, I need to rid my car of alcohol or get the hell out of here. Based on reports, we know what was left in Maura's car and what was ultimately missing from Maura's car. I won't get into all the details of her car's contents. If you want to do so, there are plenty of places out there you can find that information, but her wallet, phone, backpack, some of the alcohol, car keys were all gone. If you think it over, would someone grab her and then take the time to take certain things from her car and then lock the car up? I guess it's possible, but it seems more likely that Maura purposely took these items with her, which suggests that she was under her own accord when she left the accident scene. Although I will come back to this a bit because I have another theory based on what's missing, but for now, let's continue forward. Now that we have looked at everything up to this point, we are at the biggest question in this case. Where did Maura go from here? She could have started walking, or she could have hid nearby in hopes that the police wouldn't tow her car. I've seen people suggest that maybe she got picked up by someone driving by, or maybe a friend was following not too far behind. Now, my struggle with all of this is the fact that Butch Atwood only saw Maura at her car, so the man with a cigarette is still something I simply can't make sense of. But no one else saw anyone else physically at the scene, so I am going to have to presume Maura was there by herself. Could she have gotten into someone's vehicle? Perhaps, but I don't believe anyone followed her there. If someone had been following behind, then they would have been viewed at the scene of the accident at some point, you would think, and no one saw anyone pull up. So I'm led to believe that Maura was on foot with her belongings, so we have to ask ourselves, what was her plan from this point on? Sadly, without any more information, I can't say with any certainty what happened next. What we do know is that Maura was never seen again, so that leads me to believe in only a few possible outcomes. Her cell phone was never found or used again, which makes me wonder if she started walking in hopes of finding a cell phone signal at some point. Could she have walked the road, avoided any oncoming cars, and then potentially got lost somewhere and succumbed to the cold? I've reviewed cases over the years where bodies were found within miles of where people got lost. Even after numerous searches, a body can be hard to discover, and once time goes by and a body is left nothing more than a skeleton, it can get lost to the wilderness, and sometimes it is sheer dumb luck that any trace is ever found. I think this being the outcome to Maura's story makes a lot of sense. Now, some will point to the scent dogs finding that Maura's scent led them down the road from her car and nowhere else, but I don't think the scent dogs actually picked up on Maura's scent. We also know that no tracks were found in the area around Maura's car, so this leads me to believe that Maura may have started backtracking the way she came. So do I believe that Maura could have walked back the way she came and avoided the police? Yes, I do, but another question arises from this. If she did go back the way she came, then why didn't she ever make it somewhere and call a friend or family member for help? After all the research and ideas I have had with what happened to Maura, I believe the answer lies in knowing where she was going in the first place. We don't know of any reservations being made anywhere. So the question comes to, was she meeting someone? Now, service was non-existent in that area, so she very well could have made it somewhere and called someone from a payphone. I do think that is a logical thought in all of this. So once again, in order to solve what happened to Maura, we need to find more answers in where she was going, and in whether or not she was meeting up with someone. Before we dive into this next theory, I want to touch on the Petrit Vassi conspiracy. This means we need to go back to the night Maura left work early. At 12:20 a.m. on February 6, 2004, Petrit Vassi was discovered to have been hit and run over by a car not far from the UMass campus. To this day, the car and driver have not been found. There are tons of theories connecting Maura to Petrit Vassi. To this day, there has been no proven connection made, but it is an interesting idea. We ultimately don't know the exact cause of Maura's catatonic-like emotional state that very night, but a hit-and-run accident could certainly push someone to an emotional breaking point. Could Maura have hit Petrit Vassi? Or was Maura in a secret relationship with the person that hit Petrit Vassi? I've heard both theories, and honestly, I was going to dive into them a bit more, but I don't think they're really worth giving that much time and effort. There was never any evidence found with Maura's car to suggest she hit Petrit. Also, Maura's Saturn had what's basically the equivalent of an airplane's black box on board, and this device was looked at following her accident, and there was no sign of an accident taking place prior to the one in New Hampshire. So I think it's time people put the Petrit Vassi conspiracy to bed. Heading into the next theory, we need to rewind again to the scene of the accident. All signs point to her packing her bag and planning to leave the scene. So the next theory would be that she got into someone else's car. Why would she turn down Butch but accept a ride from someone else? Well, Butch was a big, 350-pound fellow with a mustache, so maybe at the time she didn't feel it would be safe. But he was also a bus driver, someone entrusted to drive kids around on the daily. So why she turned down Butch? We just don't know. But I do think ultimately everything comes down to the drinking and driving, which led her to wanting to get away from the accident scene. So if someone who seemed nice pulled up and offered her a ride to a gas station or a payphone or whatnot, then maybe she decided to take up that second offer. If she did so, did she happen upon a predator who saw motive and opportunity? You can't rule it out. The fact that Maura has never been seen or heard from again means we can't rule anything out. So did someone pick Maura up and then end her life? It's very possible, and if this is what happened, we may never find out what happened to her. If someone took her far from the scene of her accident, well, then she may have been disposed anywhere. Alright, let's rewind again real quick to the accident scene. This time we are going to touch on the idea of there being a police conspiracy. So hang on for the ride. In Haverhill, there were, as far as reports show, 3 police vehicles back in 2004. SUV 001, along with 2 sedans marked 002 and 003. On the night of Maura's accident, it is reported that Cecil Smith showed up on scene in the car marked 002. Trooper Monahan, who showed up on scene, has corroborated this claim numerous times. But from there, things get shaky. The police chief, Jeff Williams, is believed to have been driving 001 at some point on the day Maura disappeared. But according to reports, Jeff Williams wasn't on duty that evening, Cecil Smith was. Now, here's where the oddities begin to stack up. From 4:30 p.m. to 5:10 p.m. on the night Maura disappeared, SUV 001 was reported as being towed from a snowbank not far from Chief Williams' house. There are many who believe Chief Williams was driving the vehicle at the time, possibly under the influence. Now, at 5 p.m., there's a report of a man being pulled over by Cecil Smith in the sedan. This report, for some reason, was left out of the logs for that day, but has been corroborated by the man who was pulled over. The confusing thing is that the SUV was being pulled from a ditch at the same time, and according to reports, Cecil Smith was driving the SUV. Well, according to my calculations, Cecil can't be driving both vehicles at the same time. And he can't be at 2 different scenes at the same time. Now, there's also a report that Cecil Smith pulled over a snowmobiler at 6:26 p.m. that evening. The Murray family have attempted numerous times to reach out to this man to confirm what Cecil Smith was driving that evening, but this man absolutely refuses to speak to anyone about it. Why is this person unwilling to talk? And was Cecil Smith driving the sedan or the SUV at the time of Maura's accident? Okay, stay with me here, we're going to dive even deeper. As witness A came forward and stated that on the night of the accident, she saw police SUV 001 pass her twice before she passed Maura's accident. She also stated to have seen SUV 001 at Maura's car as she passed it on the night of Maura's disappearance. This has led many to theorize that something nefarious transpired that night. One idea is that Maura's accident was caused by Chief Williams, who was driving SUV 001, while another theory believes SUV 001 may have hit and killed Maura as it passed the scene that night. The biggest red flag was that Chief Williams had a known drinking problem. To further confuse everything, you have Cecil Smith's logged time of arrival. It is said he arrived on scene at 7:46 p.m., but Faith Westman is reported as being on the phone with dispatch when a vehicle arrives at around 7:35, 7:36 p.m. Faith Westman spoke to Fred in the days after, and she stated that she looked out her window and called the police, and kept looking out her window until the police arrived around 6 minutes later, putting the police on scene by around 7:36, 7:37 p.m., a whole 10 minutes earlier than what's been reported. So you have people placing the SUV there, you have Cecil's initial report that he arrived in the sedan, which was then corroborated originally by Trooper Monahan. I think you all can see a lot of things simply don't add up in how the police reported that night. So my biggest question in all of this is, did Cecil Smith arrive at 7:36 p.m. or did he arrive 10 minutes later? If it was Cecil Smith that arrived on site, then Maura vanished within mere minutes of speaking with Butch Atwood. If Cecil Smith didn't arrive until 7:46 p.m., then who did arrive at the scene of the accident at around 7:37 p.m.? Jeff Williams, perhaps? As you can see, The more we dive into these theories, the more questions we have that simply don't have accurate answers, and the more my head tends to spin. Some have stated that the police's dispatch record keeping was simply sloppy, which has led to all the theories and discrepancies, but I don't think we can rule out any of it 100%. As much as I would like to believe that the police would never cover something terrible up, there is always a chance that something was done to protect their own. This idea initially sounded kinda crazy to me, but as I've dug deeper and deeper into this case, and more truths have come out, the idea of the police being involved somehow starts to make even more sense. There's so much reporting after they arrived on scene that just doesn't add up. Was the car locked or not? Did they access the car when they said they didn't that night? You also have Cecil Smith sending EMS away rather quickly from the accident scene, even though there was clearly a young woman missing who could have been hurt. You have what appears to be little effort put into truly finding Maura that night, and you have the oddity that Lavoie came and towed Maura's car when he wasn't even supposed to be on call that night. Then he brings the vehicle to his own personal garage. Another thing worth noting is the bolo, or be on the lookout, that Cecil Smith called for that night. In the bolo, he reports that there is a missing woman that's 5'7". Now, this is Maura's exact height. How did Cecil Smith ascertain Maura's exact height? All they knew was that the car was registered to Fred Murray. They were told by Butch that a young woman was at the scene, but other than that, they didn't have much to go on. So this entire police theory has had me thinking more and more. What if something happened at the scene and Cecil covered it up? I'm not saying Cecil Smith killed Maura. Maybe Jeff Williams caused her harm. Maybe there was an accident. We just don't know. But from there, Cecil could have gotten into Maura's car, removed items from the car, and stashed her body in the SUV. The fact that the alcohol is missing always made me consider the idea that Maura had grabbed these items and left on her own free will. But what if the officers, maybe the alcoholic, Jeff Williams, took the alcohol for themselves? Or perhaps the tow truck driver took the alcohol for himself following the removal of Maura's car. When I was younger, this was a theory I really dove into and felt had some legs, and then as I got older, I started to look at things a little more critically and I started leaning towards Maura leaving on her own free will initially. I think the most important piece to take out of all of this is the fact that if a vehicle indeed arrived on scene at around 7:36, 7:37 p.m., then we have an extremely small window for Maura to have disappeared. I can't comprehend how no one near the scene that night saw what happened to Maura Murray. It's baffling, and it's a big part of what keeps me coming back to this investigation year after year. So to summarize so far, we have Maura leaving on her own and wandering into the woods to perish from the elements. We have the potential police being involved in whatever happened to Maura. Or we have some form of a crime of opportunity. Could Maura have been invited in by someone who lived nearby and then they took her life? Or could someone have driven up and offered her a ride? Was someone following her that she knew? Or was someone following her from the gas station she recently stopped at? Or was she meeting someone that night? Now, an interesting item was found in Maura's car that I don't think gets talked about enough. Inside Maura's car, police found a random Chrysler car part. Now, Maura's car was a Saturn, so no one seems to know why this car part was found in her car. To make matters more interesting, later, the very night she disappeared, a weird suspicious persons call came in to the police. This report was of a white Jeep Grand Cherokee with New Hampshire plates fleeing a scene around 7 miles from where Maura disappeared. This occurred a little after midnight. Now, Chrysler manufactures Jeep. Also, a white paint scuff mark was found on the Saturn's rear bumper. Could there be a connection there? I can't help but wonder who this Jeep's owner is, and were they involved in what happened to Maura? I want to make sure I clearly state real quickly that in diving into these theories, I am not making any accusations against anyone. I made all efforts to get the information I am sharing with you all as accurate as possible, but I'm not perfect. I have seen a lot of people speak on Cecil Smith's character and that he was a good man. The only reason I bring up the police conspiracy aspects of this case is that I don't think anything can be ruled out. There is a lot of conflicting information. Trooper Monahan, during the Oxygen interview, stated Cecil Smith was in the sedan, but a lot of the information we have points to Cecil being the one driving the SUV that night. Now, do I think a police conspiracy is the most likely answer as to what happened to Maura? probably not. I think it's more likely that the police arrived and a predetermined notion was made that someone was driving intoxicated and fled the scene. Cecil Smith said himself that people have fled accident sites before and usually turn up the next day when they've sobered up. The police had no idea what this case was going to turn into at the time, and I feel pretty certain that if they knew the outcome was going to be Maura still missing 20 years later, well, I think a lot of things would have been handled differently. So yes, I believe that a police conspiracy is possible, in the same way that I believe Maura could have been the victim of a crime of sheer opportunity. Now, real quick, I want to touch on the A-frame house near the accident site. A man named Claude resided there, and reports state that he got rid of his car shortly after Maura disappeared. Many have speculated about whether or not Claude was involved. He also went to the trouble of ripping out the basement carpet before he moved out of the residence. After years of talk, new owners of the A-frame house would grant access to those investigating Maura's case. Luminol would discover a boatload of blood within a closet, and wood panels from within that closet were eventually tested. The results came back positive for human blood, and it was determined to be a mix of male and female. In the end, there was not enough of a sample for them to determine who the blood belonged to. Also, police would eventually do some digging in that very basement, but nothing was ever recovered. Although I have seen a lot of people on the internet discuss that they don't think the police dug in the right spot. As you can see, there are so many theories and ideas in this case. This case has truly taken a life of its own. In closing, we still don't know what happened to Maura. Maura has been missing for over 20 years now, and the one thing that seems to be apparent is that she most likely lost her life at some point after her tragic accident in Haverhill, New Hampshire. As much as I would like to believe that she disappeared and started a new life, I simply don't think it's the most likely of outcomes. Now, for those that want to know where I lean on this case, I recently listened to the entire podcast that was put together by Julie Murray, Maura's sister. It's titled Media Pressure, and it really does a great job of going into the life of Maura and her family. It's also super informative and informational when it comes to diving into the real facts of the case. For me, I have really been looking into the police conspiracy as of late. There were some things that Julie Murray touched on that really made me reconsider whether something nefarious was going on with those trusted to investigate and find Maura. I personally love a good conspiracy theory, and until we have clear-cut answers, I'm willing to entertain wherever the clues take me. Now, the more straightforward, logical part of my brain tends to lean towards Maura leaving the accident site on her own free will. I do not think she was kidnapped out of her car. I think she either A, fled the scene and tragically perished after getting lost in the wilderness, or B, someone, whether it be nearby the accident or a person driving, offered to help Maura, and in her desperation, she chose to take that person up on their offer, and it ended up being the worst decision she's ever made. I know my ideas are nothing new, but this case is one I've been invested in for a long time. At this point, I would like to hear from each and every one of you. What do you think happened to Maura Murray? I would love to get a great conversation started in the comment section below. And as always, I want to send my deepest condolences to the Murray family. I have passionately followed and studied this case for a long time, and I truly hope that Fred and the rest of the Murrays are able to find answers and closure one day soon. And I hope that in making this video, I have respectfully done justice to Maura Murray's story. Thank you all for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. It's also very important that you hit the notification bell and turn on notifications, as you may not be alerted of my uploads if you don't do so. In the description box below, you'll find a link to my merch store and a link to the Cellar Dwellers membership tier for the channel. If you're interested, please take a moment to go check those things out. And as always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to help support this channel is greatly appreciated. And until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.